Hello and welcome back to Earthbeat Visions, a history of the future sound of London. We're here in late 1996, and just before we kick off with the Dead Cities ISDN tour, I'll have a brief moment for a couple of American reissues. With the band's Virgin albums and singles distributed stateside by the label's US dance-based offshoot Astralworks, by '96 the only notable FSY releases unavailable in America were the Jumpin' and Pumpin' album Accelerator and their most famous single Papua New Guinea, and so a deal was struck with US independent label Hypnotic to license both releases from Jumpin' and Pumpin'. While the release went largely without hitch and allowed American fans to pick up these records without forking out huge import costs, the 1991 cover likely seeming a touch out of date by the second half of the decade. To be fair to the label, they came up with a somewhat novel idea of using a lenticular jewel case ridged to give the impression of a moving 3D object on the cover. A head in a square spins as the case is tilted for Papua New Guinea. Unfortunately, this wasn't the first time the two releases have been put out with artwork not given the band's approval, with R&S Records doing much the same with the Ethnobolic sleeves in '92. The Hypnotic design is somewhat tasteful, and the designer at least attempted to use a similar font to the now typical Euro style expanded, but Garry has since mentioned his general dislike for the design, partially because it simply didn't come from the band or Boogie, and thus has no reflection on the music contained within. The EBV logo is at least present. Two variations of Papua New Guinea exist, one with orange coloured disc art, one with gold. The credits mistake the Jags Kuna and Gary Burns' additional keys reference in the Weatherall remix as them being additional musicians throughout the entire release, amusingly. There are no musical differences to the 1992 CD single. It was released on the 19th of March 1996 alongside the re-release of Accelerator, the album coming with similar art, only with 3 heads in squares this time. Again, 2 variations exist, one with purple coloured disc art, one with gold. Other than the artwork and reduced credits page, the major difference here is the inclusion of a US bonus track, the Graham Massey mix of Papua New Guinea, which feels very slightly redundant given that the Papua New Guinea single was also made available on the same day. With vinyl sales on the wane, especially in America, which had largely given them up years before, a vinyl edition wasn't pressed at the time. This version remained the only in-print version in the US market until 2001. Following the already confusing indexing and track timings over the 2 Jumpin' and Pumpin' releases of Accelerator, the 1996 reissue is a joke, with the first minute and a half of Pulse State appearing in the index for 1 in 8. This seems bizarre and ridiculous, leading to 1 in 8 having a runtime of 5 minutes 54 and Pulse State 5 minutes 57. Weird. Anyway, back to Dead Cities. ISDN Forth FM, 28th of October 1996.
Okay, let's go.
5, 4, 3. Transmit.
Whenever they found these samples, it was a great spot. Used in the majority of the 1996 shows, they've become a familiar part of the FSOL language. Broadcast on the same day Dead Cities was released, the show broadcast at Edinburgh's Forth FM on the Bonus Beats show starts in a very similar way to the previous Radio 1 transmission. We have Explosive Part 4, basically the same as the released version, unlike the looser, more improvised feel of the Radio 1 version, but it closes with the Mary Hopkin vocal sample, threatening to follow the previous show's structure exactly. Then it takes a sudden turn into weird animal noises and what for a long time I thought were elephant sounds. There are actually arrows being fired in the sci-fi martial arts B-movie Knights, which is responsible for a large number of samples throughout this, all of which sounds distinctly undead cities. This is accompaniment for melodious expression, known at the time under the name Womb, suggesting it was something recorded at Garry's home studio, maybe even a solo track. Over the top of the saxophone sampling piece is a new sting.
The future sound of London, live, via ISDN.
Followed by
You are entering audio copyright zone 2. Warning. Spoiler technology is in use.
Next up, interestingly, is a track by Leon Mars' then new alias Oil, which would be released the following year on FSOL's fledgling EBV label. Although clearly Mar would have given permission for the track's use, the appearance of another artist on a show which is promoted as a live gig by FSOL is quite a strange choice. However, they've explained more than once that they do throw in the odd track here and there while they're reloading their samplers, so that's probably what was happening here. It's followed by an environment called Slow of Motion. Interestingly, most of the Dead Cities tour environments were released on the From the Archive series, and they tend to be music and sound collages rather than based around specific vocal samples. The movie dialogue here tends to move around and be used in different environments and over different tracks, depending on the transmission. This is kind of the opposite approach to the Lifeforms 3D Headspace tour, where voice samples would be at the core of many of the environments. Antique Toy follows with a number of electronic sounds and spoken samples added over its first half. The track continues into its closing environment, crossfading into dark matter. One of a huge number of Dead Cities era pieces left off the album, it's a dark, heavily percussive number. The inclusion of many of these outtakes gives the Dead Cities tour a very different feel to the album itself. The darker sound, combined with the environments containing more field recordings and organic sounds, coming closer to the supposed urban decay label given to the album itself, a bleak exploration of the remains of a city rather than a walk around a current urban landscape of Dead Cities. The track closes with an airy environment with female vocal samples, a voice stating "take a sample there." It's an enjoyably meta sample given the band's penchant for sampling. There's another phrase which has become somewhat associated with the group via fans. Her Face Formed in Summer Tie appears in its live incarnation, quite a different take on the track, with a different bass line, a more straightforward breakbeat and a different structure. The backing ambience and guitar parts are the same as the album version, but the arrangement, also lacking the cymbal washes of the original, gives it a more lively, bouncy feel in contrast. It's an interesting take, but lacking some of the beauty and atmosphere of the album mix. The closing environment is more intense than on the album, overlaid with the old moving further into the future robotic voice. And then the band launched into Yashika, one of the many unreleased drum and bass leaning tracks from the Dead Cities sessions, a piece that shares the same choral vocal sample from Glass's closing environment. As with Dark Matter, it takes the transmission in a much darker direction. The track moves into a closing environment which would later appear on the single version of We Have Explosive Part 4, another piece utilising that same vocal sample. The darker, more aggressive mood is set aside briefly for a second Oil track, the incredibly funky Sleight of Hand, later to be the A-side to Oil's EBV 12-inch. It's overlaid with numerous samples from Nights, as well as, I have to say, that's the most amazing story I've ever heard from the Shawshank Redemption. A sample particularly favoured by Garry when trying to answer interview questions later on in the tour. With Swarm, the transmission version of Absent with Concept, and yes, that's where the channel name comes from, the show heads back into darker territory again with more D&B rhythms and a track replete with doom-laden sirens. It fades into an environment of reversed organic sounds and, amazingly, 1994 track Environment's Birds. This leads into LA4, a brighter, more mellow track than most of the then unreleased pieces from this era. This one remains unreleased to this day, never appearing on an archive album. The live version of My Kingdom plays out with the usual structure. On this transmission, water samples are included after the big synth build-up. It fades into the unreleased Kawa environment, which in turn leads into the only unknown track from the transmission. A rare example of an FSOL track with lyrics, a probably sampled voice sings "You left me here and now," and some less decipherable words, "in this broken house" maybe, over huge washes of dramatic synth chords. A fast drum machine beat comes in near the end. Animal and human voice samples from accompaniment from melodious expression are overlaid. This leads into another very organic sounding environment, later found on We Have Explosive Part 1, including the "It's Tough Out There, It's a Goddamn Jungle" sample from the 1992 film Hero. None of the transmission's environments are remotely similar to the vibe of Dead Cities itself and suggest that the shows were put together very differently to before. The 93 and 94 transmissions felt like blueprints for Lifeforms, an album which was effectively a selection of the best and most legally clearable tracks and environments from the radio shows. Here it feels much more like the album was completed and then the band began developing the broadcasts. Perhaps unsurprising then that the atmosphere of the shows is closer to that of the more desolate sound of the We Have Explosive single, recorded around the same time, than to Dead Cities itself. The appearance of Max at this point is almost jarring, the track being the epitome of the bright, beautiful and polished side of the album that's mostly missing from the live shows. Mains Interrupt, another environment, later to appear on From the Archives Volume 2, with layered voices and drones, bookends a very rare appearance of the original version of We Have Explosive, a track normally absent from transmissions. The section of Mains Interrupt following Explosive is overlaid with the You Were Right and That's Why Tonight sample from The King of Comedy, which as usual closes the broadcast. Unlike the 3D Headspace tour with its ultra-media approach incorporating visuals sent to computers from the studio, the 1996 transmissions were entirely audio-based. Talking to Launch Online, Garry explained the approach. We think that the visual aspects of music are beginning to deceive people now. It's been here for a few decades. What we're interested in is the game you can play with your ears, the ability to sit in your front room and start using your ears instead of just looking. It's like radio theatre. If you want to experience our transmissions, you don't come to hear and watch us. We're not into the visual element. FSOL are about the ears. The transmission was released in the pod room on the 1st of February 2010, with the usual cover given a green and yellow tint. As ever, tracklist in the comments below. ISDN Kiss 102 Manchester, 29th of October 96. Now this is where things get a little bit complicated. The Dead City's promotional posters list the second date of the 1996 tour as Kiss 102 Manchester on the 29th of October 96, with the Kiss FM London show being broadcast on the 6th of November. A show named Kiss 102 Manchester and dated 6th of November is available from the pod room. Where do we place this? Well, thankfully we have a bootleg of the Kiss London show and it has a very different tracklist to this, so I'm placing it here. It wouldn't be the first time a dating error appeared in the pod room. The 1996 shows differentiated from the 94 ones in numerous ways, notably the separation of spoken samples from environments, the balance being shifted more towards full tracks than long environmental elements, and the development of the shows after the album rather than before it. The other difference was the appearance of more static set lists. Like a conventional tour, Brian and Garry frequently played variations on the same show rather than switching blocks of sound around each time. Case in point, the Kiss 102 show opens with a digital voice stating the future sound of London live via ISDN for the first time on the tour, and then it's straight into We Have Explosive Part 4 again and accompaniment of melodious expression as per the previous night's transmission to Edinburgh. There are still subtle differences in the shows. For example, the Kiss 102 show, including a run of unusual spoken samples around the end of Yashika, a woman saying you can move however you wish in the programme, this way or that, go, and a man shouting, now look at this, they're only good to me as living gods. Strangely, the environment following this section has its stereo version flipped over the two transmissions. One of the more interesting differences, to an FSOL nerd like myself at least, is the switching of Swarm for its alternate take absent with concept. The environment before this section is also slightly extended for the Kiss show. The final section of the show, starting with My Kingdom, again features inverted stereo. Whether it's worth owning both of these transmissions is down to the level of fandom the individual exists in. Much like owning numerous shows from a normal band touring a very static setlist, there's going to be limited interest in two broadcasts which are largely the same. That said, there are differences here, and the repeated setlist idea is an intriguing development in the band's approach to live performance. You can certainly tell that this wasn't simply them pressing play on a tape each time, but for most people one or the other of the show is going to be enough. ISDN Northsound 1, 30th of December 96. The third date of the 1996 ISDN tour was to Northsound 1, a radio station for Aberdeen and the northeast of Scotland. Advertised as a 90-minute show, it has never been released through the pod room and no known bootlegs exist, although the material is very likely to be similar to other shows from the tour. ISDN BBC Radio Leicester, the 1st of November 96. The fourth show of the 1996 tour was to BBC Radio Leicester and exists as a fairly low quality bootleg. For some reason it was initially shared as BBC Radio 3 Live in Leicester, although there's no link between Radio 3 and Radio Leicester other than BBC ownership, and of course the band always played live in London. The bootleg only exists as a set of 4 VPR MP3s, each around 8 to 9 minutes, split that way as it was shared in 2000 when broadband internet was still relatively uncommon in the UK. Bootleg begins with an interview with Garry talking about cutting out the ego and seeing what happens, not wanting to be two blokes stuck on stage behind ironing boards. This was probably around the same time that the tour began to take on the nickname the Fuck Rock and Roll Tour. Let's talk about sampling, being collage artists, video being as important as music and such, which is a bit odd given the stuff about being anti-visuals I quoted a minute ago. But there we go. A lot of the ideas surrounding the band and their philosophies come from these brief snippets of interviews from '96, and Garry's phrase here about mincing the history of music is one that stuck. Just at the very end of the interview, as the music starts, the quality drops dramatically with a load of radio static obliterating the sound somewhat. Typical. After the now familiar live via ISDN and OK Let's Go samples, there enters a brief environment including elements of, strangely, 1994's Live in New York, before things get going with a track known at the time as Tingler 96. The track incorporates some of the Hoover synth sounds from the original Tingler, built around sounds from the outer environment of Antique Toy, and also samples from Quagmire. A slightly different studio version would be later released as War Machines. It closes with the We Have Explosive Part 1 outer environment with added samples, including a loop of a man saying "I don't know what's happening to me" and layers of other vocals. This environment continues into its related track accompaniment for melodious expression. A brief environment including water splashes, wet pavement and a lot of delayed sounds follows, and then it's into unreleased track Yage Oil Mix. This is the piece that really led fans to believe Yage would have been the third single from Dead Cities, given that Leon Marr remixed the other two singles. The clattering drums place it in similar territory to My Kingdom Part 2, albeit with more recognisable samples, the track's signature flute sample, as well as the lush synth sounds from Yage and guitar noise from the Hallucination version. It's a great remix and one I hope will eventually get a studio quality release of if a deluxe edition of Dead Cities or something similar ever comes out. Maybe we'll get a nice exhaustive super deluxe box set from Virgin one day.
You want confidence, a pledge, safety. Guarantee. Promises.
Sample there from the film Simple Men. The rest of the show plays out with similar tracks, environments and samples to earlier Dead Cities transmissions. The arrangement of My Kingdom features fewer samples overlaid in the quiet bits than on previously heard broadcasts, but has slow of motion over its closing drum part. The version of Explosive, here in its Heard Killing mix, features the band playing with delay effects near the end, which, combined with the harshness of the radio interference and the FM and cassette compression, makes it the punchiest and most aggressive the track has ever sounded. Oil's sleight of hand closes the show, followed by the now familiar You Were Right closing speech.
We are dreamy here. We feel like we've just had half an hour of meditation. It was absolutely brilliant.
The presenters were impressed, and as Garry sounds ready to go, he gets roped into a brief conversation with Dylan, an FSOL fan who works on the show. Still, from that slightly awkward interview, we learn that...
Yeah, there's a battle going on in the studio as we speak, between the two of us. Yeah, maybe it's the only way to go, actually. I mean, as we called on our last album, you know, everyone's into weirdness right now, and it is becoming the norm almost, you know, to hide behind weird sounds. So maybe the best way now is to get a bit more coherent.
In hindsight, that's a very intriguing phrase. The cover I made for the bootlegs is one of my least awful from the period. ISDN Galaxy 101, 1st of November 96. The fifth date of the 1996 ISDN tour was to Galaxy 101, a Bristol-based station, and was the first of the band's two shows in the night run, broadcast a few hours after the Leicester transmission. Advertised at running to an hour, and these things can't always be trusted, the poster also advertises the Leicester broadcast as an hour even though it's a half-hour show. No bootleg is known to exist, and a version has not been released on the Podroom. ISDN BBC Radio Nottingham, 2nd of November 96. The sixth date of the ISDN tour to BBC Radio Nottingham, and another which has not been released on the Podroom or via bootleg. ISDN Radio Aire, 2nd of November 96.
We're the Future Sound London, and we're playing to you from a sleazy district of London. And here's 30 minutes of head-blending sonics.
Garry's introduction to the Radio Aire show is unusual in that it involved no interview or announcement from the show's presenters at all, but simply Garry on his own. Would have been odd to listen to, I'm sure. The usual introduction samples and mangled opening environment follow, and then the unreleased You Left Me Here and Now track. Some We Have Explosive Heard Killing noises on top. It starts a now familiar run of tracks, environments and samples used in subtly different ways to previous shows at times, such as elements of My Kingdom Part 4 having much more distinct prominence layered over the live version of My Kingdom. The track also ends earlier than on previous versions and fades into a very bizarre vocal sampling environment. The environments featured in accompaniment for melodious expression and We Have Explosive Part 1 appear without linking to either track. The transmission ends with material not heard on any earlier known broadcast, the closing environments of Dead Cities and Glass. Transmission closes with a new environment, operatic vocals from Yage and the Girl in the Park from Glass, jazzy piano and a helicopter, followed by the usual You Were Right speech over Mains Interrupt.
Okay, Leeds, this is the Future Sound London signing off. Have you enjoyed it? We did.
And so the band's second show on the evening of the 2nd of November 1996 ends. Transmission remains officially unreleased, but a decent quality bootleg MP3 version has circulated online since 2001. ISDN BBC Radio Derby, 3rd of November 96. The 8th date on the tour, apparently a 30-minute show, another officially unreleased and not with a known bootleg. ISDN Red Dragon Radio, 3rd of November 96. The 9th date to Red Dragon Radio in Cardiff, a 60-minute show apparently, and yet another unavailable one. ISDN Kiss FM, 5th of November 96. The The final transmission of the UK leg of the 1996 tour went out to the band's old home, Kiss 100 FM in London. I've already stated the title and date mix-up with the 102 Manchester broadcast earlier. A poor quality bootleg exists online under the name Live in London 1996, and its muffled sound, 112 kbps a second bitrate and repetition of other shows make it only of real interest for archiving purposes. There was in fact an interview with DJ Paul Thomas before it, but this doesn't seem to be attached to the bootleg, circulating occasionally online as a separate little file in itself. It's a mildly interesting interview. It does feature Garry talking to somebody he seems to know and respect, which really helps. It's nowhere near as awkward as all the others. Still, the most intriguing question, how the band feel they've developed since the time of Lifeforms, is the one to be answered with the Shawshank Redemption sample. Garry obviously doesn't want to talk about their music to that level of depth. The setlist is pretty much the same as the Berlin broadcast, which, as that exists in studio quality, is the best direction to head for the rest of this transmission. At this point in the tour, it's the most extensive show, with a number of previously unheard tracks. We have Explosive Part 2, Electronic 1, LA4, Insides, Punk City, Carlos in its first appearance since '95, The Empty Land, LA7, Mango Tree, We Have Explosive Oil Door and The Exhibition, as well as some incorporation of early transmission environments into the mix. At 1 hour 24:49, Garry mutters, "Bit of a cock-up there," which is a very rare example of the band communicating mid-session. Tellingly, during the LA transmission, which features a very similar tracklist, the section before that is much longer, and it seems like the cock-up was the ending of Glass early, with it fading into the following environment oddly. Little moments like this are nice reminders that this material is going out live, rather than the band simply pressing play on a pre-recorded show. And again, if you are a nerd like me, they just make owning these occasionally repetitive bootlegs that little bit more worthwhile. An exclusive environment closes the transmission, containing reworked elements of the Study of Six Guitars environment. Paul Thomas thanks the band for their sound collage tonight at the end. ISDN Fun Radio, 8th of November 96. The second leg of the 96 tour began with the first 3 transmissions the band broadcast to French station Fun Radio. Transmission actually began with Garry attempting his French in conversation with the presenters, put through a pitch shifter, as heard on the bootleg version. He informs them the band will be playing Sonique Electronique as well as answering questions with samples of laughter, all on top of a background environment of sounds frequently used in the tour. This is the second documented case of this kind of interview after the Kiss FM one, a step on from the fairly plain interviews or simple introductions as heard on most of the UK shows. Garry later told Toronto Sun, "I'll do interviews on the radio before a gig and some of the questions I'll answer straight, some through a voice processor, and for some I just drop appropriate voice samples taken from films that can say more than I can. Fancy words for what is basically trolling." The aforementioned bootleg also gives us a date for the transmission, as the one given with the Podroom release is clearly completely wrong. It's a largely familiar show of known music, environments and samples, with the usual subtle variation. We Have Explosive Heard Killing features a lot of spoken samples on top, there's some metallic percussion added near the end of Max, War Machines is overlaid with Kawa, and We Have Explosive Part 1 environments. The transmission ends with the first known broadcast of Everyone in the World, an ambient track bringing the show to a slow, almost serene end. Final sample is the first appearance of the Bonjour Monsieur, what? It's French. Oh, quote, which finds a fitting home on this first French transmission. It was released in a Podroom update on the 1st of February 2010, credited as being broadcast on the 17th of May 97. ISDN VPRO Radio, 11th of November 96. Having developed variations on a particular setlist earlier in the tour, Brian and Garry tried out a very different running order for this broadcast to Dutch station VPRO. Although not released on the Podroom, a bootleg of the first 46 minutes has been shared online for years. An opening interview features the Dutch presenter, pitch shifted, asking Garry questions about the show to come. This features the first known appearance of oft-quoted phrases like the best pickpockets in town and sampling from the waste bins of time. He also speaks about not wanting to work with superstars with egos. When one question is answered with a sample, the presenter replies,
"Hey Garry, we don't take no shit from a mission."
The section closes with
FSOL is a world deeper than me. Garry. Use whatever we can get our hands on. And right now it's VPRO radio. Please. I have my hands on you. pollen.
It's one of the more fun and playful, less cringy interviews from the era. A more complete version of this setlist, with subtle differences in effects and sample usage, appears later to Fun Radio and on the ISDN show promo CD, which I'll discuss further on the appropriate entries for those shows. My favourite individual moments here are the added delay on the drums in Hallucination and the particularly gnarly end to My Kingdom. ISDN Fritz Radio, 6th of December 96. Another month, another country, another ISDN transmission on the Dead Cities tour, and it's another confusing one. As we'll see when it comes to late 2001 transmissions, sometimes the version available from the pod room doesn't seem to match the version previously bootlegged. In this case, the Fritz radio transmission to Berlin appears to be a completely different show with an entirely different track list. Unless they perform two shows to the same station that night, not impossible but very unlikely, then the most likely situation is the band's recording of the show got mislabelled at some point down the line. The one released on the Podroom is the same set list as the Kiss 100 FM transmission from October, minus the final 10 minutes. However, an expanded version of this set list also appears on the 1997 Groove radio show to LA, making it still of comparatively little interest for anyone other than collectors, except for one thing. It opens with an exclusive version of Yage, with an odd staggered drum and bass-ish beat, layers of Simon Wells' guitar, the extended Hallucination guitar outro, and stack of humanoid Intruder Alert samples. Is a fascinating version of the track, which isn't heard on any other known broadcast other than this and the fairly low quality Kiss FM show. The amount of non-album material in this particular set is higher than any of the other arrangements from the tour, including a wonderful run of tracks around the 20-minute mark. The You Were Right spoken sample now appears midway through the show rather than at the end. The exclusive tracks Latronic 1, LA4 and One Without No Title are on the more open synthetic end of the Dead City spectrum, closer to the likes of Glass than the darker, more aggressive drum and bass sound of much of the transmission exclusive material. Snippets of environments also appear between tracks and also overlaying dark matter. The brighter sound returns once more near the end with 3 new tracks, Insides, Honesty and Mango Tree, and bizarrely a remix of Tired and Live in New York. These 1994 tracks feel slightly out of place here, but the remix is intriguing, throwing a drum machine into the previously beat-free tracks. The end simply fades out halfway through Glass. The bootleg transmission is a variation on the 4th FM transmission, again with its own subtle differences in effects and samples, but nothing too dramatic or new. ISDN Israel National Radio, 1996. Nothing's known about this show other than the occasional mentions in interviews that they broadcast a transmission to the national station in Israel during the ISDN tour. This will most likely have been in November or December 1996. ISDN Radio Leverkusen, 1996. Another show only known by reputation, due to it being repeated on the same station in 1998, and that was once listed as an actual 98 transmission, considered a holy grail by fans as a radio appearance during their wilderness years. There's no date, but it's likely to have been during the European leg of the 96 tour in November or December. Garry also mentions a Tokyo show a few times in interviews, which almost certainly came from this era as well. ISDN Groove Radio, 22nd of January 1997. After a Christmas break, Brian and Garry returned to the ISDN cables to broadcast their first show to a US radio station, Groove Radio in Los Angeles. Quite a lot seems to have been made of the show, bootlegs including the introduction with the presenter mentioning they'd been talking about the show for weeks, and giving away FSOL Groove packs to lucky winners of a competition. Could the band meet the hype? Absolutely. If I was asked to recommend only one show from the Dead Cities tour, it would be this one, hands down. At 2 hours, it's the band's longest transmission since 1994 and contains a huge amount of unreleased material, plus all the tour regulars. It opens with Yage Oil Mix, always an enjoyable rarity, and then heads off into a previously heard set list closest to the Fritz Radio Berlin transmission, or at least the one released through the pod room. The Crunchy Breaks track at 21 minutes is exclusive to this particular set list, and it's a weird sounding piece, not quite fitting into the Dead Cities sound, or indeed any other era particularly. The glitchy samples and odd subtle melody are reminiscent of Orteka, while the gunshot sample is downright strange. LA4 seems to be named after its appearance here, as is LA7, although that was later released under the name Honesty. Following Mains Interrupt, the transmission goes off into completely new territory, including the then recently delivered oil remixes of Wave Explosive, an otherwise unreleased version of the single version of Life Forms, plus The Empty Land and The Exhibition. ISDN era spoken samples, Cosmic Unconsciousness and Leave the Lights Alone Please, as well as the closing environment from the CD and cassette editions of Slider, changed the mood slightly, and another EBV artist, Simon Wells' Headstone Lane, gets a premiere with his track Back in the Day. Things head even further out with some 3D Headspace tour environments. As ever, even with the same set list, there is some variation between the shows, although often subtle. This transmission includes a strange spoken sample talking about stars and twilight during the middle of Her Face Forms in Summertime. Quagmire is introduced with a future sound of London sting rather than the She's Beautiful movie sample, as well as removing the live via ISDN sting from the Berlin show. Insides is a slightly longer cut than on earlier shows and lacks the live via ISDN sting. The mix from Punk City to Psycho Crab is completely different, featuring an unedited version of the latter. An additional future sound of London sting appears at the start of Carlos, which features reversed stereo compared with the Fritz radio release and lacks the live via ISDN sting. The horse environment from the 1994 sessions appears after Mango Tree. A future sound of London sting appears just before Glass. They're not earth-shattering changes, but again act as a reminder that these shows went out live, and crossfades and sample usage did vary from show to show. Back to the bootleg, and the show ends with a 15-minute interview with Garry and the presenter initially talking over each other quite a lot. Garry also declaring "Hello LA." Lol. In the UK, this was happening at 8 AM, which he declares is normally his time for meditation and hypnotherapy. Hints of the hippie era are definitely seeping through by this point. He then goes on to detail other countries transmissions have appeared in, including totally undocumented shows in Italy, Norway, Russia and Croatia. Are our records that incomplete, or is this Garry playing with the truth? Who knows? Another revelation, Garry had given up writing tracks every day, trying to live more and get out of the neurotic frame of mind of needing to be constantly working, a very different perspective to the much more wound up, unhappy vibe of his 1994 interviews. There's a mention of them getting back into remixing, including working on remix for Supergrass, a track that would never be properly finished, and the results only heard about 20 years later. More talk about creating audio-visual transmissions that would never surface. At some point, Brian clearly gets bored and starts messing around with his synthy AKS, squelchy noises practically obliterating Garry's speech. There's a lot of interesting stuff about the dynamic between the band, Boogie and the team around them. The show was released on the Podroom on the 1st of February 2010, incorrectly dated as a 1996 broadcast. However, I really would track down the bootleg if you can, the interviews are just fantastic. ISDN Fun Radio, 27th of February 1997. Probably the most widely heard of all the band's ISDN transmissions, the February 97 Fun Radio broadcast was released weeks later as the ISDN Show promo CD, or more likely the ISDN Live one, which was released in France. It follows the setlist as previously heard on the VPRO transmission, and that matches up with ISDN Show being released in the Netherlands. The first two-thirds of the show is fairly standard fare for this tour with all the usual suspects. The final run of tracks includes less regularly played material including Insides, Carlos, Everyone in the World and Arrived, which close the show on a largely more ambient note than anything on the main album. With ISDN Show often fetching high prices on the second-hand market, the FSOL digital release of this show in 2010 made it easy for fans to get a digital copy of a coveted release. Only Glass appears in the same arrangement as its album version, making it a worthwhile alternative take on the Dead Cities era. And that is the last known release on the Dead Cities tour. Up next will be We Have Explosive, and then a run of ISDN shows which started an entirely new era for the band, and that's what I'll be discussing next week. In the meantime, drop me some comments below. These shows are really popular, so I'd love to hear your thoughts on them. Did you catch one of these when they were broadcast? I did used to sometimes have Radio Leicester on, and I always wonder what it would have been like if I'd happened to have tuned in at the exact moment FSOL were playing. Anyway, yeah, there's a comment section down there. I always love reading your comments. There are also like, subscribe, share buttons you might want to press as well. All interaction really helps my channel, and I hope you join me next week for We Have Explosive and the start of the ISDN sessions.